Imagine being stopped by someone who doesn't know who you are, not really. Someone who only sees you as a face, a skin color, a stereotype. Imagine the cold eyes of authority locking onto you, searching, not for understanding, but for power. Power to control you, to put you in your place, to humiliate you. All because of what he thinks you represent, a threat, an outsider, something he needs to control. Now, picture this. You're standing there, minding your business, your only crime being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The flashing red and blue lights casting an eerie glow over everything around you, making shadows dance across the pavement. People start to watch, curious, concerned, maybe even a little judgmental. You feel the weight of their eyes, but you hold yourself steady, calm. You've faced worse, much worse. But he doesn't see that. No, this officer doesn't see your strength or your resilience. He sees what he wants to see, and he believes he can put you in your place. Now ask yourself, how would you react if someone stripped you of your dignity, made you feel small in front of a crowd? Would you fight back? Or would you stay silent, knowing that sometimes silence can be the loudest statement of all? But here's the thing. This officer, he doesn't know the full story. He's playing a game he doesn't realize he's about to lose. Because who he's looking at, who he's trying to humiliate, isn't just any person. She's someone with a story, someone with power, someone with a badge of her own. Imagine the shock that'll hit him when he finds out who she really is. Now, let's take a step back. Let me tell you about her, who she really is, a woman with a remarkable life, a woman who has spent years dedicating herself to justice. Her name is Lisa. She's a Black woman who doesn't just wear the FBI badge. She honors it, she upholds its values, and she's proud of the work she's done. To her, it's more than a job. It's a mission. It's a commitment to keep people safe, to fight for fairness in a world that doesn't always value it. Lisa didn't get to where she is easily. Every step, every achievement has been hard-won, a testament to her resilience. She's been out on cases that would make most people flinch, a protector in the shadows, bringing criminals to justice, comforting victims, facing danger head-on. She's spent hours, sometimes whole nights, working cases that weighed heavy on her shoulders, losing sleep but never losing sight of her purpose. Each time, she reminds herself she's here for the people who need her, for the communities she serves. But as a Black woman, even within her own agency, Lisa has faced battles that others around her could never fully understand. Some people, even in her own field, haven't always looked at her and seen an equal. They've seen stereotypes, assumptions. Sometimes it felt like she had to prove herself twice over, first to show she was good at her job, and second, to break through the barriers of prejudice that lingered in the minds of those around her. There were moments in her career, powerful, pivotal moments, when she had to speak louder, push harder. In a room full of agents where voices are supposed to be equal, hers didn't always feel that way. She's been questioned, doubted, even looked over by some who should have been her allies. But she never let it stop her. She pushed on, carrying that badge with pride, showing up to work every day with a sense of duty that ran deep, rooted in something greater than herself. This was who Lisa was, a woman with a powerful, unshakable belief in justice. She'd built a career not just on her skills, but on her integrity, on her empathy. She'd earned the respect of those who truly knew her, who knew her worth, who understood her commitment to the people she served. But for some people, none of that mattered. For some, Lisa was just a face, a color, something to be labeled and boxed in. Even with a badge in her pocket, there were places, people, who only saw her skin before they saw her humanity. It's a weight she's carried, quietly, patiently, sometimes painfully. In the eyes of certain strangers, even ones sworn to serve and protect, her identity spoke louder than her authority. And so, on this day, she found herself stopped, her intentions questioned, her very presence scrutinized by a man who saw none of her story. It was an ordinary day. Lisa was off duty. No uniform, no badge on display. Just Lisa, out in the world like anyone else. She was running errands, something she rarely got a chance to do with her busy schedule. She enjoyed these moments, the chance to be just another person in the crowd, blending in, with no one needing her, no cases, no files, no investigations. Just a day where she could be herself. She had planned to pick up a few things, a couple of items for the house, maybe a coffee from her favorite shop, and then head over to visit family. She drove down streets that felt familiar, places she knew well, in a neighborhood where she felt comfortable, where her guard could be down. But today, something felt different. As she passed through an intersection, her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and there it was, a patrol car. Just a routine police vehicle, nothing to be concerned about. She'd seen countless patrol cars in her line of work. Still, as she drove, something about this one made her uneasy. It seemed to stick close, keeping pace behind her, following her turns, staying right there. A presence she couldn't shake. She took a deep breath, telling herself it was probably just a coincidence. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at her. She pulled into a small store parking lot, thinking maybe that would be the end of it, that the patrol car would keep going, that it wasn't her they were interested in. She even let herself chuckle a little, brushing off the feeling. After all, she wasn't on duty. She was just Lisa today, blending in like anyone else. She stepped out of her car, checking her phone, her mind already on what she needed to pick up from the store. But as she turned toward the store entrance, there it was again, the patrol car, pulling in right behind her, as if it had been waiting for her to stop. She felt it instantly, that shift in energy, the way his eyes narrowed, scanning her. She tried to shake it off, to remind herself that she had done nothing wrong, that this was a public space, that he had no reason to focus on her. She took a steadying breath, reminding herself to stay calm. Years of training, of facing dangerous situations, all had taught her how to keep her cool. But this wasn't a life or death scenario. It was something that, in its own quiet way, felt just as heavy. She knew this look. She'd felt it before. The cold, calculating look that some people gave her before they even knew her name, before they understood her story. He approached her slowly, as if sizing her up. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he looked her over from head to toe, making judgments before she'd even spoken a word. She turned toward the store, hoping he'd lose interest, but as she walked, she could hear his footsteps following behind, closing the distance between them. Lisa's mind raced. Should she ignore him? Keep walking? Should she turn around and confront him, let him know that she was not someone to be intimidated? Or should she simply stay silent, knowing that sometimes silence says more than words ever could? What would you do in that moment? Speak up or keep walking, feeling the eyes of judgment boring into you? She decided to keep moving, to stay focused. But her heart was beating faster, each step a reminder of her strength and of the countless moments she had been in situations like this. Moments where, despite everything she knew, despite all her accomplishments, her identity came first in the eyes of others. As she reached the store entrance, she felt a firm hand on her shoulder, stopping her in her tracks. She turned slowly, meeting the officer's gaze. He looked at her with that same look of authority, that self-assured air that spoke volumes without a single word. The officer's voice was cold, with a hint of challenge. "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to see some ID." Lisa looked at him, the surprise evident in her eyes, but she didn't let her calm expression falter. She could feel the eyes of other shoppers turning toward them, watching, judging, perhaps assuming she had done something wrong. She felt that familiar sting, the weight of others' assumptions pressing down on her. She reached slowly for her wallet, keeping her movements calm, collected. She knew better than to escalate, knew that sometimes a steady hand spoke louder than anything she could say. But in her mind, she couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration. Here she was, someone who had dedicated her life to law enforcement, being treated like a suspect. It was a feeling she knew too well, a reminder that no matter what she achieved, to some, her identity spoke louder than her title. As she handed him her ID, she watched his face closely, looking for any sign of recognition, any flicker of understanding. But there was none. He glanced down at her ID, then back up at her, his eyes filled with skepticism. What he didn't know was that she was carrying more authority than he could imagine. The officer held her ID in his hand, looking at it, then looking at her, his expression unreadable, but his demeanor sharp, skeptical. He didn't see the professional, the dedicated agent, who had spent years upholding the very laws he swore to protect. All he saw was what he expected to see, a stranger, someone who, in his mind, didn't belong. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight, a slight smirk playing on his face. His tone dripped with authority, with a kind of disdain that spoke louder than any words. "So, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tinged with accusation, as if he already knew she'd have no legitimate answer. He leaned in, holding her ID up like it was some kind of evidence against her, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. Lisa met his gaze, calm but resolute, a stillness in her that hinted at a lifetime of handling moments like these. She'd been in high-stakes situations, had faced down people far more dangerous than this man before her, and she knew how to keep her composure. This was nothing new. But still, the injustice of it gnawed at her, a quiet reminder of how easily she could be mistaken, how little her achievements mattered in moments like this. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully, her voice steady and respectful. "I'm just running some errands," she replied, her tone betraying nothing of the frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. She wasn't here to make a scene. She knew better. But that calm seemed to irritate him, seemed to stoke a fire that he was all too eager to let blaze. He leaned closer, tilting his head, his eyes full of suspicion. "Errands, huh?" he scoffed. "That's what they all say." He looked her up and down, sizing her up in a way that made her feel small, like she was somehow less than the person she was. His voice dropped to a low, accusing tone. "You look out of place around here. Why don't you tell me what you're really doing?" She felt the sting of his words, the subtle but powerful way he tried to diminish her, to strip her of her dignity. But she didn't let it show. She stood her ground, her face calm, her eyes unwavering, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. In her mind, she drifted back to scenes from her life, her years in training, pushing herself to the limit, proving herself over and over in a system that sometimes seemed set against her. She remembered the nights she'd spent away from her family, the sacrifices she'd made, the moments of doubt that she'd overcome to earn her place in the FBI. She remembered her first case, the nerves, the fear, and the strength she'd found in herself to step up and deliver justice. Back then, she'd thought once she wore the badge, once she proved herself, she'd be seen for who she truly was. And yet, here she was, standing before a man who saw none of it, who couldn't see past his own assumptions. He took a step back, crossing his arms, his expression hardening as if he'd made up his mind about her. "You're hiding something," he said, his voice dripping with confidence. "I know it. You people always think you can slip by like no one will notice. But I notice, and I'm not going to let you walk away that easy." She held back the urge to shake her head, to correct him, to remind him of just how wrong he was. But she knew better. She knew that any sign of defiance, any hint of frustration, would only give him more reason to escalate. So, she remained silent, her calmness an act of strength, an act of quiet defiance that she hoped would speak louder than any words. Would you have spoken up in that moment? Would you have challenged him, told him who you really were? Or would you, like Lisa, choose the silent strength of calmness, knowing that sometimes silence says more than anything you could say? But he wasn't finished. The silence seemed to bother him, as if he couldn't stand that she wasn't reacting the way he expected. He wanted her to break, to show him that he was in control, that he could make her feel small. So he leaned in, his voice a cold whisper. You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can play innocent? Well, let's see what else you're hiding. He stepped back, his hand hovering near his radio, his eyes still locked on her, watching, waiting for any sign that he could use against her. And then, without another word, he demanded, Empty your pockets, now. Lisa's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. She wanted to resist, wanted to stand her ground and remind him that he had no right to make such demands. But she knew that resisting, even in the smallest way, could make things worse. So, with a deep breath, she complied, reaching slowly into her pockets, showing him that she had nothing to hide. And yet, even as she did, he only grew more suspicious, as if her calmness was some kind of defiance he couldn't tolerate. He leaned closer, inspecting her belongings, his eyes filled with disdain. Her mind drifted again, to a moment from her training, her first encounter with danger, the first time she'd been out in the field, face to face with someone who didn't care who she was, who saw her only as an obstacle. She remembered the fear she'd felt and the strength she'd found in herself to push through, to stand tall, to do her job with integrity. She'd thought those days would prepare her for anything, but here she was, facing someone who was supposed to be on her side, someone who saw her as a threat without even knowing her name. The officer wasn't satisfied. He demanded more, asking her questions in a tone that made it clear he didn't expect the truth, as if each word she spoke only confirmed his suspicions. "What else are you hiding?" he sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You people think you can just walk around, pretending to be something you're not. You think that I won't see through it, but I do." She felt the weight of his words, each one a reminder of the assumptions he held, the judgments he'd made without knowing a thing about her. She held her ground, her silence now a shield, a way to protect herself from his ignorance, his hatred. But in that moment, as he watched her with those cold, suspicious eyes, he still didn't know who she really was. He had no idea that the woman he was trying to belittle, to humiliate, was someone who held more authority, more power than he could ever imagine. And in the quiet of that confrontation, as he stood there, thinking he was in control, she knew something he didn't, that the tables were about to turn. Because soon he would find out exactly who he was dealing with, and when he did, everything he thought he knew would come crashing down. The officer's stare hardened, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to resist. He shifted his weight, his hand hovering near his belt, and then he made a decision, one that would change everything. Without a word, he reached for his handcuffs, pulling them out slowly, almost deliberately, as if savoring the control he held in that moment. And then, without giving her a chance to explain, without asking another question, he grabbed her wrist and locked the cold steel around it. The metal clicked loudly, the sound cutting through the quiet air, sharp and final. She froze, a wave of shock washing over her. She felt the cuffs close around her other wrist, her arms pulled behind her back, and in that instant, she felt stripped, exposed. Here she was, an FBI agent, a protector of the law, being treated like a criminal in front of strangers, people who had no idea who she was, what she stood for, or the life she had dedicated to justice. The officer held her arm firmly, guiding her out of the store, his grip tight and unyielding. She could feel the eyes of bystanders turning toward her, their gazes filled with curiosity, judgment, and, in some cases, quiet disdain. Whispers began to spread through the small crowd that had gathered, people nudging each other, exchanging glances, some with looks that seemed to confirm their worst assumptions. "Did you see that?" one person whispered. "Must have done something serious," another muttered, casting a sidelong glance her way. She wanted more than anything to speak up, to tell them who she was, to wipe away the looks of judgment with a simple truth. But she held her silence, knowing that any word she spoke could be twisted, used against her. She felt the humiliation settle deep within her, a raw ache that pulsed with each second under the gaze of the crowd. She wanted to scream, to remind them that she was someone who deserved respect, someone who had earned it in ways they couldn't imagine. Would you have spoken up in that moment? Would you have tried to defend yourself, to reclaim your dignity? Or would you, like Lisa, choose to hold your silence, letting the quiet strength within you be your only shield? As the officer guided her toward his patrol car, his hand firm on her arm, he leaned close, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You thought you could fool me, didn't you?" he sneered. "I know you're kind. You think you're above the law, that you can just walk around like the rules don't apply to you. Well, not on my watch." His words stung, each one a reminder of the prejudice he clung to, the assumptions that clouded his judgment. But she kept her head high, her eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to let him see the pain he'd caused. She knew that showing her pain would only fuel his sense of power, his belief that he'd succeeded in putting her in her place. She remembered her days in training, the long, grueling hours she'd spent proving herself, her instructors pushing her to her limits, testing her resilience, her commitment. She remembered the pride she'd felt when she'd earned her badge, the sense of accomplishment that had filled her when she realized she'd made it, that she was part of something greater than herself. But standing there in those handcuffs with strangers, watching and judging, that pride felt distant, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. They reached the patrol car and the officer opened the door, pushing her inside with a roughness that spoke volumes about his disdain. She sat there, her wrists still bound, her mind racing. She wanted to tell him, to reveal the truth, to shatter his illusions with the simple fact of who she really was. But she waited, holding onto that truth like a shield, knowing that the right moment would come, that there was power in waiting, in letting him think he had control. The officer slammed the door, walking around to the driver's side, and the crowd began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied. But as she looked out the window, she could still see their faces, the lingering traces of judgment, the whispers fading, but their impact still heavy on her heart. Inside the car, the silence settled between them, thick and tense. The officer glanced at her through the rear-view mirror, a smirk tugging at his lips. "You're not so tough now, are you?" he sneered, his voice filled with a confidence that came from his mistaken belief that he held all the power in this situation. She could feel the weight of her badge in her pocket, a quiet reminder of who she truly was, of the authority she carried, authority that went far beyond his comprehension. She knew that when she finally revealed her truth, it would shatter his arrogance, wipe away that smirk, and leave him facing the consequences of his own ignorance. But for now, she waited, letting him bask in his illusion of control, letting him believe that he had the upper hand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she broke the silence, her voice steady, calm, but carrying a strength that cut through the tension. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. her tone laced with quiet power. The officer laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "I don't care who you think you are," he replied, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're just another nobody who thought they could get away with something, but not today." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering, her calm demeanor unbroken. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, her words steady, each one a revelation, a truth that cut through his assumptions like a blade. He stared at her, his smirk faltering for a brief moment, his confidence shaken, but not broken. And then he laughed again, a harsh, disbelieving sound, as if the very idea were too absurd to even consider. "Yeah, right," he scoffed. "An FBI agent, sure, and I'm the president." But she didn't flinch, didn't waver. She held his gaze, her calmness unbroken, letting the truth settle, letting it speak for itself, because she knew, in that moment, that his disbelief wouldn't change the reality of who she was. What he didn't realize was that he was about to face the full weight of his mistake, because soon he would come to understand just how wrong he was, and just how much he had underestimated her. The patrol car pulled into the police station parking lot, the gravel crunching under the tires, the building looming ahead with its plain, unremarkable brick walls. But inside, Lisa knew, awaited a world where her life could shift dramatically based on a single moment of judgment. She sat in the back seat, her hands still cuffed, her expression calm but her heart beating steadily with the weight of what was to come. The officer stepped out, his smug grin never faltering as he opened her door, gripping her arm firmly as he helped her out. He held his head high, proud, as if he'd made some grand accomplishment. Lisa walked silently beside him, her head held high, her steps deliberate and steady. Even now she maintained her dignity, a calm resilience that seemed to bother him more than he'd ever admit. As they walked through the precinct's doors, officers and staff went about their day, barely glancing their way at first. But as the officer guided her through the station, her hands still bound, eyes began to turn. A few raised their brows, others whispered, and some simply stared, their expressions flickering with curiosity, judgment, even quiet amusement. The officer guiding her walked with a spring in his step, clearly relishing every moment. In his mind, he had caught someone who had dared to defy him, dared to challenge his authority. And now, in front of his colleagues, he was going to make an example of her, to teach her the consequences of stepping out of line. He glanced over his shoulder, grinning at a few nearby officers who watched him with mild interest. "Got myself quite the catch today," he called out, his voice brimming with pride. "You'd be surprised what some people think they can get away with." Just walked right into her little game. The nearby officers chuckled, nodding along, some throwing her looks of disdain, others smirking as if she were the punchline of a private joke they all shared. She felt the weight of their stares, the quiet scorn that seemed to fill the room. And yet, she remained silent, refusing to let their assumptions break her calm. Would you have spoken up in that moment? Would you have told them who you were, tried to break through their prejudice with the truth? Or would you, like Lisa, choose to stand silently, knowing that sometimes patience can reveal the truth in ways words never could? He guided her to an empty chair near his desk, forcing her down with a light push, and began recounting his version of the events to his colleagues, spinning the story as if he were some kind of hero. She was acting suspicious, he said, shaking his head with mock disappointment. And when I asked her what she was doing, she got all cagey, looked at me like she was hiding something. One of his colleagues leaned in, glancing her way with a look of quiet disapproval. "Really?" he asked, half amused. "She give you any trouble?" The officer grinned, shaking his head. Nah, she knew better than that. Didn't say much, just kept quiet, looking guilty as hell. And get this, She had the nerve to tell me she was an FBI agent." He laughed, and the others joined in, the sound filling the room with a harsh, mocking echo. But Lisa sat there, her face a mask of calm, her gaze steady. She had heard enough of these taunts, enough of the laughter, to know that speaking now would only feed their assumptions. So she waited, her silence a quiet defiance, a reminder that her truth was greater than any of their judgments. Her mind drifted back to a moment just a few months ago. She'd been sitting in a conference room surrounded by her FBI colleagues, her team gathered around her as she delivered the closing brief on a high-stakes case. She remembered the look of respect in their eyes, the way they listened, the way her words carried weight, the way her experience and knowledge were valued. That day, she'd felt the full weight of her accomplishments, the pride of her work, the dignity of the badge she wore. She'd felt her purpose, her commitment to justice, burning bright within her, a guiding force in everything she did. And now, here she was, surrounded by officers who saw none of that, officers who didn't know or care about the sacrifices she had made, the nights she had spent working tirelessly to bring criminals to justice. To them, she was just a suspect, a woman with no authority, no value, someone who didn't deserve their respect. The officer leaned back, crossing his arms as he looked her over, his gaze filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Think she's learned her lesson yet?" he asked, smirking at his colleagues. One of them chuckled, shaking his head. "Probably not," he replied. "People like that, they never learn." The officer looked back at her, his smirk widening. "Well, maybe we can help her understand that actions have consequences." Lisa felt a flicker of anger rise within her, a quiet, simmering rage that she kept contained. She wanted to speak, to remind them of who she was, to tear down their smug satisfaction with the truth. But she held her silence, knowing that sometimes silence can be the most powerful response. Would you have held back, kept your calm, knowing that they were so wrong about you? Would you have spoken up, demanded respect, or let their words pass, waiting for the moment when their assumptions would come crashing down? She kept her gaze steady, meeting the officer's eyes with a quiet intensity, refusing to break under his scrutiny. She knew who she was, knew her worth, knew that her truth was greater than his assumptions, and she knew, with a certainty that grounded her, that soon he would realize the full extent of his mistake. Because what he didn't know was that the very person he was trying to humiliate had the authority, the power, and the courage to turn the situation around in a way he couldn't even begin to imagine. And when that moment came, he would find himself facing the consequences of his own actions in ways he had never expected. The atmosphere in the station was thick with a quiet arrogance as the officers smirked, satisfied with his catch, his eyes gleaming with pride. Lisa sat there, bound by cuffs but unbroken, her face calm, her gaze steady, her patience unwavering. Her silence was her strength, a shield against the taunts and smug glances, the mocking laughter and quiet whispers that filled the room around her. But what none of them realized was that the moment they thought they had all the power was the very moment it would slip through their fingers. Just as the officer leaned back, a superior entered the room, a man with a sharp, authoritative gaze, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room. He noticed Lisa sitting there, surrounded by officers who looked on with smug satisfaction. But as his eyes settled on her, his face shifted, a flicker of recognition lighting up his expression. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he observed her more closely, as if piecing together a puzzle. Then suddenly it clicked. His eyes widened slightly and he straightened, his demeanor shifting from one of casual authority to one of respect and disbelief. Aid? he asked, his voice low but filled with a dawning realization. The officers around him fell silent, their smirks fading as they looked at him, confusion and unease spreading across their faces. The officer who had brought her in, still seated with his arms crossed, frowned, glancing between Lisa and his superior. "Excuse me, sir?" he asked, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. The superior stepped closer, looking directly at Lisa, ignoring the others. "Are you Agent Lisa Ryan?" he asked, his tone now filled with unmistakable respect. Lisa met his gaze, her calm expression never faltering, and gave a slight nod. "Yes," she replied simply, her voice steady, unbroken. In that single word, the truth settled over the room like a weight, a realization that rippled through the space, shaking the confidence of everyone who had dared to doubt her. The officer who had detained her sat there, frozen, his smirk now replaced with a look of disbelief, his face pale as he processed what he'd just heard. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile the woman he had dismissed, mocked, and humiliated with the title she now claimed. "Wait, you're really FBI?" he stammered, his voice weak, barely a whisper. She held his gaze, her calmness cutting through his disbelief, her silence more powerful than any words, and in that moment, he realized the full weight of his mistake. In her mind, Lisa recalled the countless moments when her title had given her authority, the respect she'd earned through her hard work and dedication, the ways she'd fought for justice, not just for herself, but for others who had been silenced. And here she was, in this room, facing those who had doubted her without reason, who had assumed her worth was less than their own simply because of what they saw on the surface. The superior cleared his throat, his expression turning cold as he looked at the officer who had brought her in. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice laced with quiet anger. The officer stammered, trying to form a response, but no words came. He looked down, his confidence shattered, his arrogance crumbling, as he realized that the woman he had treated like a criminal, the woman he had humiliated in front of his colleagues, was someone who commanded far more respect and authority than he'd ever considered. Would you have spoken up in that moment or let the silence speak for itself? Would you have demanded an apology or let the weight of their mistake settle over them, knowing that their actions would haunt them more than anything you could say? Lisa remained calm, letting her presence fill the room, a quiet, dignified reminder of who she was. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to demand respect. Her silence was enough, a powerful statement that left the officers around her feeling small, exposed, and deeply ashamed. But then, as the sapeur prepared to release her, she leaned forward, looking directly at the officer who had detained her, her gaze sharp, focused, filled with a strength that cut through the silence. "Tell me," she asked, her voice low but firm, her tone carrying the weight of her experience and authority. "If you'd known who I was, would you have treated me any differently?" Her question hung in the air, a quiet accusation that cut deeper than any anger or resentment could. She didn't ask it to make him feel small. She asked it to make him reflect, to confront the prejudice that had guided his actions, to understand the impact of his assumptions. The officer looked down, his face flushed, unable to meet her gaze. He opened his mouth to respond, but found that he had no answer. Her question had stripped away his authority, leaving him with nothing but his own shame, his own regret. And in that moment, as she stood there, free from his assumptions, he realized that he had not just underestimated her. He had betrayed the very principles he'd sworn to uphold. The room felt heavy, as if the very walls bore witness to the weight of everything that had just happened. A silence lingered, thick and uncomfortable, wrapping itself around each person in the room. The officer, who had once held his head high with a smug sense of authority, now stood with his gaze lowered, his shoulders slumped, the reality of his actions settling deep within him. His superior cleared his throat, stepping forward, his face a mask of disappointment mixed with anger. He fixed his gaze on the officer, his voice cold, each word carrying the weight of a reprimand that cut through the quiet. "Do you have any idea the magnitude of your mistake?" he began, his tone low but firm. "This isn't just about what you did to her," he continued, gesturing toward Lisa. "This is about the integrity of our station, the respect we owe to every person who walks through that door." The officer shifted uncomfortably, still unable to meet his superior's gaze, his face flushed with shame. He knew now that he had not just wronged her, he had betrayed the very values he was supposed to protect, the principles he had sworn to uphold. Would you have stayed silent, watching him face the consequences of his own actions? Or would you, like Lisa, find the strength to speak, to make sure that this moment was more than just a reprimand, that it was a lesson that would resonate far beyond this room? Lisa took a steadying breath, her eyes never leaving the officer's face. She knew that this was her moment, a moment to remind them all that the power of a badge comes not from authority, but from respect and integrity. She stood tall, her voice calm but filled with a quiet strength as she began to speak. "When I became an agent," she started, her tone even and resolute, "I did it because I believed in justice, because I believed that the law was meant to protect everyone, not just some." Her gaze shifted around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer, her words sinking deep, finding their mark. "I've dedicated my life to this work, to making sure that no one ever feels the way you made me feel today. You saw me and assumed that I was something I'm not because of the color of my skin, because I didn't fit into the narrow mold you expected." Her voice didn't waver, her voice clear, each sentence a powerful reminder of the truth she carried. The officer looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret, his arrogance stripped away, replaced by a vulnerability he had not shown before. He opened his mouth to speak, but her words held him, silencing him with the weight of their truth. "I wasn't just a target today," she continued, her voice strong, unwavering. "I was a reminder that no uniform, no badge grants anyone the right to judge another, that the power you wear on your chest should come with the humility to see each person as they are, not as you expect them to be." Would you have found the strength to speak your truth in that moment, to remind them of the power that lies in respect, in seeing beyond the surface? Or would you, like so many others, have chosen silence, hoping that your silence might speak for you? Her words hung in the air, filling the room with a profound sense of reflection, a quiet weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. The officers' superiors stood silent, their faces a mixture of respect and regret, each of them realizing, perhaps for the first time, the full impact of what had just unfolded. Finally, the superior turned to the officer, his expression stern. "Apologize," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument. The officer looked at Lisa, his face flushed, his hands shaking slightly. He swallowed, struggling to find the words, but knowing that nothing he could say would fully undo the damage he had caused. And yet, he owed her this, owed her the respect he had denied her from the beginning. I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, filled with the weight of his remorse. "I shouldn't have treated you that way. I made assumptions, and I was wrong." Lisa nodded, accepting his apology, but she didn't let her gaze soften. She knew that an apology was just the beginning, that true change would come only if this moment left an impact, a lasting reminder of the lessons they'd all learned today. Her superior nodded to her, his expression one of respect, of quiet acknowledgement of her courage and resilience. "You're free to go, Agent Ryan," he said, his voice steady. "And thank you for reminding us of the true meaning of justice." She inclined her head, a small nod of respect, before she turned to leave. As she walked out of the station, She felt a sense of relief, a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had come through this with her dignity intact, her spirit unbroken, a testament to her strength and resilience. The sun was bright, the sky clear, a stark contrast to the heaviness of the station. She took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs, the warmth of the sun on her skin. She had faced down prejudice, had stood strong against assumptions that had tried to diminish her, and she had come out stronger. As she walked away, her head held high, she knew that her silence, her strength, and her truth had spoken louder than any anger or resentment ever could. She hadn't just walked away from this experience as a victim, she had walked away as a symbol, a reminder that respect and justice are rights, not privileges, and that true authority comes from understanding, not power. She wasn't just a victim. She was a reminder to every person in that room, to every officer who had doubted her, and to everyone who might one day hear her story, that no uniform, no badge, grants anyone the right to judge another. True power, true justice, lies in the courage to see beyond the surface, to see the humanity that connects us all. And as the door of the station closed behind her, Lisa didn't just leave a building. She left behind an experience that would linger, a reminder of a reality many endure but few ever speak of. Walking away that day, she was more than a single person wronged. She became a symbol of the resilience it takes to stand tall when the world tries to make you small. But let's pause for a moment. Let's reflect on what this story really means, on the ripple effects that moments like these have on our society, on our hearts, on our sense of justice. Think about it. How often do people like Lisa, people with dreams, ambitions, and the strength to make a difference, find themselves trapped in moments defined by someone else's prejudice? How often are they judged not by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin, by assumptions and biases they never asked for? This was more than just an encounter between a woman and a misguided officer. This was a lesson, a harsh, undeniable reminder of the impact of racial profiling, of how easy it is for authority to be misused when guided by bias rather than justice. Lisa's experience reveals the cracks in a system that is meant to protect, but sometimes, for people like her, becomes another source of pain. Would you have stayed silent as she did, allowing the moment to play out, choosing dignity over confrontation? Or would you have felt the need to speak up, to defend yourself, even if you knew it might only deepen the situation? These are questions that linger in the mind, that remind us all of the strength it takes to face discrimination without letting it define us. And this is the reality, isn't it? Racial profiling doesn't just strip people of dignity in a single moment. It chips away at the trust that should exist between individuals and the systems meant to protect them. When assumptions take the place of fairness, when skin color becomes the lens through which decisions are made, we lose more than just the respect of one person. We lose the trust of entire communities, the integrity of our shared values, the strength of our society's foundation. Lisa's story forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths. It asks us to consider the quiet, pervasive power of implicit bias, bias that often goes unchecked, that creeps into decisions without warning, that shapes perceptions before we've even spoken a word. How many others, like her, have had to bear the weight of these biases in silence, choosing patience over anger, strength over despair? In our everyday lives, how many times do we make assumptions, even without realizing it? How many times do we judge someone before we truly see them, before we understand the story that lies behind their eyes? These are the questions Lisa's story brings to the surface, questions that challenge us to confront our own biases, to examine the way we view others, to consider the impact of our actions on those around us. What if, instead of seeing each other through the lens of assumptions, we allowed ourselves to see the full picture? What if every person we encountered, every stranger on the street, was given the chance to be seen for who they truly are, not just for what we think they might be. This is the challenge, isn't it? To look beyond the surface, to push past the easy judgments, to allow ourselves to see others not as strangers, not as others, but as individuals with their own strengths, their own dreams, their own stories. The officer who judged her that day saw none of this. All he saw was a face, a color, an assumption. And in that assumption, he allowed prejudice to strip her of the respect she deserved, to reduce her to something less than herself, to try and confine her worth within the narrow limits of his own bias. But isn't that what implicit bias does? It blinds us, narrows our view, making it impossible to see people for who they truly are. And when this bias comes from those in positions of authority, when the power to protect becomes a tool of judgment, it isn't just one person who suffers. It's a society that suffers, a community that loses faith, a trust that is broken. As we consider Lisa's story, ask yourself, how do we change this? How do we move toward a world where everyone is given the respect they deserve, where authority is used to uplift rather than to oppress, where our differences are seen as strengths rather than as barriers? Lisa's story reminds us that the journey toward justice is ongoing, that equality isn't something we inherit. It's something we must build, something we must protect every single day. It's in the choices we make, the assumptions we challenge, the respect we offer to those around us. Because, in the end, justice isn't just about the laws we follow. It's about the values we live by, the dignity we show to each other, the humanity we show to each other. And so, as Lisa walked away from that station, head held high, she wasn't just reclaiming her dignity. She was leaving behind a legacy, a reminder that respect isn't something we give because of a uniform, a title, or a badge. Respect is a right, something owed to every person in every moment. Her story echoes in the hearts of those who hear it, a quiet but powerful reminder that our world can change, not through anger or division, but through understanding, through the courage to confront our own biases, and through the strength to see each other as we truly are. This is the legacy of her story, a story that challenges us all to be better, to look deeper, to live with justice, not just in our laws, but in our hearts. Because in the end, true power doesn't lie in authority. It lies in empathy, in respect, in the simple, profound act of seeing each other with open eyes and open hearts. And maybe you're wondering, what can I do? How can I make a difference? Sometimes, change begins with something as simple as a choice to see people as they are, not as we assume them to be, a choice to pause, to reflect, to question our own perceptions, a choice to treat each person with the respect and dignity they deserve, even when no one else is watching. If Lisa's story moved you, if it reminded you of the power we each hold to make the world a fairer, more compassionate place, don't let it stop here. Share her story. Spread it as a reminder, as a call to others, as a beacon of the strength that comes from empathy and understanding. Comment below if you've ever faced moments where you felt judged, where you had to stand tall against assumptions that tried to diminish you, or share your thoughts, your insights, your experiences with us. Because each story, each voice, has the power to change hearts, to open minds, to inspire a future where respect isn't something we demand, it's something we live by. And if you want to hear more stories like Lisa's, stories that challenge, that inspire, that remind us all of the strength that lies within each of us, don't forget to subscribe. Join us on this journey as we uncover the truths that shape us, the resilience that guides us, and the humanity that connects us all. Because together, we can be the change. Together, we can build a world where respect is the rule, not the exception. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for choosing to be part of the difference.